The rain fell in a steady drizzle over London, painting the cobblestones of Whitechapel Road with a glossy sheen. It was autumn 2023, and the city felt heavier than usual, as if the weight of its history pressed down harder with every passing year. In a small cafe tucked between a halal butcher and a shuttered bookstore, Thomas sat nursing a lukewarm coffee, staring at the street outside. He was a journalist, once proud of his city's cosmopolitan buzz, but now he felt like a stranger in it. The neon signs in Urdu and Arabic flickered across the road, and the chatter around him was a mix of languages he couldn't place. He wasn't angry, just tired of pretending he didn't notice how much had changed. Thomas had been reading Douglas Murray's book, The Strange Death of Europe, when he first felt the unease settle in his bones. It wasn't the immigration itself that bothered him. It was the way everyone seemed to tiptoe around it. He'd grown up in a London of fish and chips, red buses, and pubs where old men argued about football. Now those pubs were half empty, replaced by shisha lounges or converted into flats for newcomers who didn't seem to care about the city's past. Murray's words echoed in his mind. Europe is committing suicide. Or at least its leaders have decided to commit suicide. Thomas wasn't sure if it was suicide or just exhaustion, but he felt it too. A city, a continent, losing its grip on what it was. He opened his notebook, where he'd scribbled notes from a recent trip to Greece. He'd visited a migrant camp on Lesbos, a sprawling mess of tents and desperation. There, he met Amina, a Syrian woman with tired eyes and a scarf wrapped tightly around her head. She'd fled Damascus after her husband was killed, her home bombed to rubble. "I just want safety for my children," she told him, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. Thomas had listened, moved by her story, but also struck by the sheer scale of it all. Thousands like Amina, arriving daily, overwhelming the island's resources. The Greek officials he spoke to were exhausted, muttering about Brussels and its endless directives. "They tell us to open our borders," one officer said, "but they don't live here. They don't see this." Back in London, Thomas felt the same disconnect. He remembered the summer of 2015, when Angela Merkel's voice boomed across Europe. "Wir schaffen das. We can do this." She'd opened Germany's doors to 1 million migrants, and the ripple effect hit every corner of the continent. Thomas had been in Cologne that New Year's Eve, covering the celebrations for a British paper. The night had started with fireworks and laughter, but by midnight the square was chaos. Women were screaming, surrounded by groups of young men, many of them newcomers from North Africa or the Middle East. The police were overwhelmed, and later Thomas learned they'd been told not to report the attackers' origins. "Don't want to stir up trouble," an officer had muttered to him off the record. Over 1,200 women were assaulted that night, and the silence that followed felt louder than the screams. Thomas sipped his coffee, glancing at the TV in the corner of the cafe. A news report showed protests in Paris, where locals clashed with police over a new mosque opening in a neighborhood that once housed a cathedral. The cathedral had been sold off years ago, its pews empty, its congregation dwindled to a handful of pensioners. Murray had written about this too. Europe's churches, once the heart of its culture, now museums or mosques. Thomas remembered visiting a church in Amsterdam, now a nightclub, where strobe lights danced across stained glass. It was beautiful in a way, but it felt like a funeral. Across the cafe, a young man named Ali sat with his friends, laughing over plates of kebabs. Ali was born in London to Pakistani parents, and he loved the city, its hustle, its diversity. But he also felt the tension. At school, his teachers had pushed British values, but what were those anymore? Tolerance? Democracy? The same teachers seemed embarrassed to talk about Shakespeare or Churchill, as if those names carried some ancient sin. Ali had read Murray's book too, secretly, because his friends would call it problematic. He didn't agree with everything, but one line stuck with him. Europe has lost faith in itself. Ali saw it in the way his classmates rolled their eyes at Remembrance Day, or how his local council debated renaming streets tied to colonial figures. He wondered if they'd rename his street one day, named after some forgotten Victorian poet. Ali's father, Imran, had come to Britain in the 1970s as a guest worker, one of thousands invited to rebuild a war-torn nation. Imran worked in a factory, saved every penny, and raised his family to respect the country that gave them a home. But Ali noticed his father's growing unease. "They don't want us to fit in anymore," Imran had said one night, watching a TV debate about integration. "They want us to be something else, neither British nor Pakistani." Ali felt caught in the middle. He loved his mosque, his prayers, but he also loved Arsenal games and a pint with mates. Was that not enough? Thomas caught Ali's eye across the cafe and nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement. He wondered what Ali thought of it all, the protests, the changing city, the endless debates about identity. Thomas had interviewed people like Ali before, young men torn between worlds. One, a Somali teenager in Stockholm, had told him about no-go zones in his neighborhood, where police rarely patrolled and gangs ruled the streets. The boy wanted to be a doctor, but his school was segregated, half the kids barely speaking Swedish. "I want to be part of this country," he'd said, "but it feels like they've given up on us." Back in his notebook, Thomas wrote about his visit to Budapest, where he'd met a politician who admired Murray's work. The man, a supporter of Viktor Orban, showed Thomas the border fence Hungary had built to stop migrants. "This is about survival," the politician said, gesturing to the barbed wire glinting in the sun. "We're not cruel. We just want to stay hungry." Thomas had seen the other side too. Migrants stuck in Serbia, families sleeping in fields, children crying for food. He felt the pull of both arguments, the need to help and the need to protect. But Europe seemed paralyzed, unable to choose. The cafe door swung open, letting in a gust of cold air. A woman named Clara entered, shaking rain from her coat. She was a teacher, one of Thomas's old sources, and she joined him at the table. "You look like you're carrying the world," she said, smiling faintly. Thomas told her about his trip to Greece, about Amina and the camps. Clara nodded, her face clouding. She taught in a school in Birmingham, where most of her students were children of immigrants. "They're good kids," she said, "but it's hard. Some parents don't want their girls learning about evolution or mixing with boys. I try to teach British history, but half the class thinks it's all about slavery and empire." Clara had read Murray too, and she agreed with his point about guilt. "We're so ashamed of our past," she said. "We can't even celebrate what's good. Magna Carta, the abolition of slavery, the NHS, none of it matters if we're just apologizing all the time." She told Thomas about a school assembly where they'd stopped singing Christmas carols because some parents complained. "It's not about inclusion," she said. "It's about erasure." Across town, in a community center, a group of activists met to discuss the latest anti-racist campaign. They wanted to rename a street named after Lord Nelson, the hero of Trafalgar, because of his ties to the colonial era. One activist, a young woman named Layla, argued passionately, "We can't keep glorifying oppressors." But an older man, a Jamaican immigrant named Winston, pushed back. "I came here because of Britain's history, not in spite of it," he said. "You erase Nelson, you erase my story too." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Winston had lived through the Windrush era, worked as a bus driver, and raised a family in a country he loved. He didn't understand why his grandchildren's generation seemed so angry at it. Thomas met Winston later at a pub in Brixton. The old man's hands were calloused, his voice warm but firm. "This country gave me a chance," he said. "But now it's like they're ashamed of themselves." "If they don't believe in Britain, why should I?" Thomas thought of Murray's words again. Europe's cultivated self-distrust. He saw it in the way politicians dodged questions about immigration, in the way comedians self-censored to avoid being canceled. Even Thomas felt it in his own writing, choosing words carefully to avoid being labeled a bigot. The next day, Thomas took a train to Manchester, where a protest was brewing. A group of locals had gathered outside a mosque, chanting about taking their country back. Counter-protesters, waving signs about tolerance, shouted back. Thomas watched from the sidelines, notebook in hand. A young man named Omar, a second-generation Moroccan, approached him. "They think we're all terrorists," Omar said, gesturing to the crowd. "I was born here, I work in IT. I just want to live my life." Thomas listened, then asked about the mosque. Omar hesitated. "Some of the preachers, they're not like me. They tell kids to reject the West." "I don't agree, but what can I do?" Thomas thought of Cologne again, and of Sweden, where he'd covered a story about rising crime in migrant-heavy areas. The statistics were stark. Foreign-born individuals were overrepresented in violent crime, though no one liked to say it. Murray had called it a disappointing failure of multiculturalism, and Thomas saw why. It wasn't about hating immigrants. It was about values clashing. Omar wanted to integrate, but others in his community didn't. And Europe, too ashamed to enforce its own rules, let the divide grow. In a quiet moment, Thomas visited a church in Manchester, one of the few still holding services. The vicar, an elderly man named Peter, welcomed him. "We used to have hundreds here," Peter said, gesturing to the empty pews. "Now it's just us old folks." He told Thomas about a nearby church that had been sold to a developer, turned into luxury flats. "We've lost something," Peter said. "Not just God, but who we are." Thomas thought of the mosques he'd seen, packed with worshippers, and the contrast struck him. Europe's soul, whatever it was, seemed to be slipping away. Weeks later, Thomas was in Berlin, walking through Kreuzberg, a neighborhood transformed by Turkish and Arab immigrants. He met a German woman, Anna, who ran a small bookstore. She loved the area's diversity, but admitted it felt less safe than before. "I don't say it out loud," she whispered, "but sometimes I miss the old Berlin." She told him about her daughter, who'd been harassed at school for being too German. Anna didn't know how to respond. "We're taught to feel guilty," she said. "Colonialism, the Nazis, it's all we learn. But what about Goethe? What about Bach?" Thomas thought of Murray's point about Europe's guilt complex, how it paralyzed the continent. He remembered a conversation in Paris with a French policeman who described no-go zones in the banlieues, where officers feared to patrol. "It's not France anymore," the policeman said. "It's something else." Thomas had seen the same in London's Tower Hamlets, where Sharia patrols sometimes roamed, telling women to cover up. He didn't blame the immigrants. He blamed the leaders who let it happen, too afraid of being called racist to act. Back in London, Thomas met Ali again at the cafe. They talked late into the night, sharing stories. Ali spoke of his dreams, starting a tech company, raising a family, but also his fears. "I don't want my kids growing up in a place that's ashamed of itself," he said. "But I also don't want them growing up in a place that hates them." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of it. He thought of Amina in Greece, of Omar in Manchester, of Anna in Berlin. They all wanted to belong, but the ground beneath them was shifting. As winter settled over Europe, Thomas kept writing, piecing together the stories. He wrote about the protests, the empty churches, the crowded mosques. He wrote about the politicians who promised solutions but delivered chaos, about the ordinary people caught in the middle. He quoted Murray in his final piece, "Things that can't go on won't." Europe was at a crossroads, and Thomas wasn't sure which path it would take. But he knew one thing. The continent he loved was changing, and it wasn't just the rain that made it feel colder.